Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 is close enough. Let the milking commence. Jokes aside, I've never really talked about Season 1 as a whole. Sure, I made a video highlighting the negatives, but I haven't talked about the visuals as a whole, both the good and the bad. And yes, there is a reason for that. You see, I have attempted to write the script for this particular topic multiple times in the past, but it never worked out. Because how do you go about a video like that? Every single episode from this show, without exception, featured multiple impressive cuts of animation. There's only so much you can talk about. So yes, that's your disclaimer. I won't talk about every single impressive cut because of course I won't. Like and subscribe. Jujutsu Kaisen was a massive production. Nearly every major freelancer in the entire industry worked on this project. It was directed by Sang-Woo Park, an action director with a decent-ish track record, and a fondness for martial arts. The direction for the most part isn't spectacular, but it gets the job done. Jujutsu Kaisen is an action-oriented show and Park handles that aspect really well. The fights, regardless of how important they are, feel impactful. They are well choreographed and well animated, but presented in a questionable manner. You see, the actual 2D animation throughout this show looked spectacular, but everything around it, the art direction, the compositing, the 3D backgrounds, they left a lot to be desired. I'll talk more about that in a bit. Park was the series director, but that's not all. He was also one of the most important animators for this show. He animated huge chunks of action, including most of the Gojo-Jogo fight from episode 7, which did get heavily kneecapped by the bad 3D backgrounds and the poorly composited digital lava effects. While his animation is often impact-heavy and rough-looking, in a good way of course, he can animate other stuff because no this incredibly smooth piece of action from the final episode, for example. He also animated this ridiculously complex perspective shot with top-notch fabric animation. Also, lots of amazing effects animated by Park can be seen throughout this show. The volume of work done by him is simply unreal. He was the backbone of this show's action. His rough, heavy presentation, incredible smear work and top-notch action choreography is worth dying for. Yes, a couple of his cuts did look underwhelming, but come on now. As I previously mentioned, the all-around presentation left a lot to be desired. The art direction looked too busy and often clashed with Tadashi Hiramatsu's detail-heavy character designs. In a vacuum, yes, this is a good drawing, but it's a bit too detail-heavy when it's a part of a moving scene. The 3D backgrounds were particularly bad. I don't know how much of it is the modeling and how much of it is the bad filter work added on top of it, but either way, they look bad, come on. The compositing isn't good either. The unnecessary blurring, the awful filters, the excessive texture work on the curses, the poorly executed accents, you name it. The tunnel fight from episode 10 is the most extreme example of these issues. It's the ugliest fight in the entire series. The background looks awful, the movement is awkward and stiff, the original layout got butchered, and the compositing aka the blurring and filter work looks atrocious. Jujutsu Kaisen is very impressive visually, but it has a lot of flaws. Back to the positives, Jujutsu Kaisen featured lots of freelance animators and by extension, lots of strong animation. Koki Fujimoto was an important animator. His heavy, lifelike movement was the highlight of the first episode. Something as simple as Megumi climbing up the stairs, running down a hallway, and turning looks amazing. The way he loses his balance for a second while turning looks so real. Movement isn't the only thing Fujimoto is good at. His effects animation looked top tier. The paintbrush-like effects look amazing, they really helped shape this show's visual identity. He also animated the black flash scenes, which looked phenomenal. The black and red effects look really good, and his thick, inky smears go well with these effects. And speaking of effects, the way this show handled the look for the cursed energy is really impressive. I love the thick outlines and the color work. Another major name involved with this project is Shota Goshizono. He directed two of the best looking episodes. Episode 8 was relatively limited, but Goshizono's direction made it interesting. Every scene had a sense of three-dimensionality and volume to it. Even simple scenes like these had strong perspectives. Also, look at how creative this sequence is, even though it's essentially just a panning background with some effects. He also directed episode 17, which was probably the best looking episode in the entire show. It started off with this incredible Ken Yamamoto sequence with some amazing and impactful timing. Workreek's animation looks top notch. The amount of movement is really impressive, especially because of how detailed the characters and their outfits are. The staff list for this episode featured Takeshi Menami, Tatsuya Yoshihara, Yukina Kosaka, Goshizono himself, and more. Menami's timing dependent impactful animation with the strong smears looked particularly good. Goshizono came through with a ridiculously impressive cut. The camera no-clips through the gun barrel. How do you come up with something like that? He mapped this entire scene out in 3D, by the way. Episode 17 looked amazing. Yes, the 3D backgrounds did bring down the overall quality a bit, but it was a lot better than the 3D forest in episode 7. The Ryu Nakayama directed episode 19 was very interesting. The color work looked quite unique. It had this dry feel to it. It was another stacked episode which featured key animation from Tatsuya Yoshihara, Keiichiro Watanabe, Koki Fujimoto and more. Fujimoto animated the Black Flash scene with the amazing impact frames and effects. This scene built up the anticipation really well. In fact, this entire episode felt different in terms of presentation. Ryu Nakayama is of course the series director for Chainsaw Man, a show which felt very different. The Tatsuya Yoshihara scenes were very well animated as you'd expect. He gets across Yuji's anger through his body language instead of a black and white paintbrush art style change. And then of course we have Keiichiro Watanabe's insane sequence. And this is a good place to talk about his work throughout this show. He animated this short but incredible scene from episode 2. The background is really well coordinated and the quick cuts are well timed. The impact feels, well, impactful, with a great build-up and an amazing perspective on the background. His sequence from episode 11 had some really poor 3D background work, and here's where the controversy begins. A lot of people don't like this particular style of animation. They feel like the movement is too floaty and lacks weight, but here's the thing, that's the point. It's not the compositing department's fault, because how would you go about adding backgrounds to a scene like this? His animation is meant to be the way it is. That's his style. Animation doesn't need to make sense. A wall exploding into cubes doesn't make sense either, but it looks good. His scene in episode 19 is no different. The characters are always moving. The quick cuts are really well timed, and the scene feels chaotic, and it works. Episode 19 was really good looking all around. It did have a couple of rough moments, but as a whole, it looked great. Watanabe's sequence was the centerpiece, and the movement-heavy Tatsuya Yoshihara scenes around it made it feel more natural. Hironori Tanaka's contribution wasn't as impressive as you'd expect, all things considered. Sure, his work in episode 13, an episode he directed, storyboarded, and was an animation director for, looked incredible. He animated some amazing hands, blood, and nearly a whole minute worth of character acting in his signature style, which is so good. The episode also featured an incredible work creek sequence. Again, the amount of movement is really impressive, especially because of how detailed the characters are. Every character here moves in a different way, and each character interacts with the other perfectly. It's so well thought out and executed. Kai Shibata's hand animation and Ren Onodera's disturbingly lifelike sequence is also very well done. This episode was great, but the rest of Tanaka's work isn't that impressive. His sequence in episode 4 isn't really much of anything, and his animation in episode 20 was weirdly slow and clunky. The compositing does it no favors either. What is this background? Who thought it was a good idea? His work in the final episode looks solid, although someone pointed out how big Nobara's nose is here, and I can't unsee it now. Episode 20 was an interesting episode, but not in a good way. They tried to continue with the dry look from the previous episode, but without Nakayama's direction, it looked mediocre. The compositing is particularly awful. What is going on with the trees here? Also, Takashi Hashimoto's effects are barely visible because of how bright this scene is. And I already mentioned the clunky action animation. Something similar happened in episode 16 with the panda fight. The final episode was a stacked one, no surprises there. It featured names like Hironori Tanaka, Keiichiro Watanabe, Tatsuya Yoshihara, Koki Fujimoto, Sanghu Park himself, and more. The 3D backgrounds in this episode looked quite mediocre. They were unnecessarily dark and overly busy. They dragged down the 2D animation in my opinion. That just about sums up the major points. Episode 9 was a solid looking episode. The compositing was actually decent for once. Episode 23 featured strong animation but also suffered from some mediocre compositing and color work. Animators such as Yuki Yamashita, Eiji Komatsu, Reina Egawa, and more were important contributors as well. Yoshihide Idio's sequence from episode 6 also looked incredible. Like I said, it's impossible to go over every impressive scene, so this is the best I can do. Don't get it twisted. As a whole, Jujutsu Kaisen was a very good looking show. The amount of incredible 2D animation is ridiculous. It could have looked a lot better, yes, but it did look great. Season 2 of course will undergo a major overhaul. I have already discussed the staff changes in a different video. My expectations are high. That's about it. Don't have anything better to do with your life? Check out this other video on screen. Make sure to like and subscribe, and until next time.